Hi, I'm Skipper Chung Warson, and welcome to Season 2 of the How This Works show. Thanks for tuning in. I run a business called How This Works Co., specializing in service and product design, workshop facilitation, and leadership coaching. On this show, though, we focus on the journeys of people who excel at their respective areas of craft, exploring how they got started, where they are now, and the valuable lessons they picked up along the way. Today, I have Andy Polaine with me. He's a design leadership coach. We'll talk about many topics, but mainly it'll focus on his current work as coach and how that draws from his background as a filmmaker, designer, and more specifically, a service designer. He wrote one of the standard books on service design. Andy, thanks for taking time to chat with me today. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on. Pleasure to be here. Nice to see you again, too.
Nice to see you as well. So let's start with pronouns. I'm he, him. How should I refer to you?
I'm also he, him.
Great. I said a little bit in the intro about your general area of expertise, but I'd love if you could build on that.
Yeah, so maybe just quickly, my journey is the easiest way to kind of get to where, what I'm all about, I suppose.
Sure.
I've been involved in what you might loosely understand as sort of digital for just over 30 years. Mm-hmm. I was a very, very early person involved in interaction design and making interactive media back in the very early 90s. I originally studied film, video, and photography, and this new thing called interactive multimedia, and that was my sort of shift into that. And that was before things like UX or interaction design, and all of those things had names. We were really struggling to find that.
Sure.
And throughout that time, then I've been doing quite a lot of that and teaching a lot of that too. I started teaching quite early. Then I moved into service design in the early 2000s. Mm-hmm. I had a conversation with my friend and co-author Ben Reason when I just visited LiveWorks studio in London. About a year after they had opened, and he explained, well, we're doing this thing called service design. And I'd been very interested in organizational design, and that's how it kind of gelled for me.
I see.
And then, as you and I know, we worked at Fjord. I worked at Fjord, where I was part of a thing called Fjord Evolution, which was also an educational thing within Fjord and Accenture.
Sure.
And for clients, but also a regional design director for APAC at Fjord.
Yeah.
And then since then, I left, and I still train. I still teach sometimes groups of people about service design and other things like storytelling and presentation. Mm-hmm. I co-lead a master's of service design in the Hochschule Luzern in Switzerland. But my main job is doing design leadership coaching.
Okay. So Andy, is there something about your background that might be surprising for folks listening? Something you feel comfortable sharing?
Some people can probably hear it from my accent, and I don't know how surprising this is, but I was a privately educated in boarding school in the UK, so proper Harry Potter stuff. But, having lived all over the world, not all over the world, but I've lived in Germany for a very long time. I've lived in Australia twice. Mm-hmm. And living in another culture has really, really changed the way I then see and understand how people communicate with each other. And I think that's probably one of the things, even just learning another language. I'm fluent in German, for example, is very interesting when you then consider your own language.
Oh, I didn't know you were fluent in German.
See, there you go. Unexpected.
There you go. Yeah. So, Andy, let's dig into the meat of the show. And you talked a little bit about your journey broadly, and I expect we might jump into certain places here and there. But even more deeply than that, how did you get interested in the notion of design? You talked about design and storytelling and some of those other adjacent areas, not just to service design, but also how did you get interested in some of these other places?
So my dad was a graphic designer and ended up having a sort of branding and ad agency. And my brother trained as an industrial designer, a proper product designer. And
it's almost a family business.
It is almost a family business. And actually, I kind of didn't really want to do design. Perhaps the other unexpected things about me is that I always feel a bit of an imposter because I actually didn't study design because I studied the other stuff that I talked to you about before. Design sort of came to me later on. In fact, it took me a good year or two after graduating to call myself, back then we called ourselves interactive designers, but to add that word on. I wanted to be a filmmaker. I wanted to be a film director. And I think so that's probably where all the storytelling stuff comes from. And there's lots of ways of working. And my most recent podcast actually is with Julian Simpson, who is a guy who's a screenwriter and a director. And we had a really good conversation about that because I think there's lots to learn. And then I guess, I sort of, in that sense, I slipped into design because, people needed people who could make interactive stuff. And
Sure.
I was one of those people.
Got it. You studied filmmaking, and then how did that transition from going from that mode of working, that area of work, into design? How did that bridge for you?
Yeah, so it wasn't just film. So it was film, video, photography, and multimedia as it was back then.
Got it.
And so for me, I was interested in all of those things. I really enjoyed doing like sound design and sound editing and things too.
Yeah.
And editing and camera work, all of that stuff. And back then, so this was when Macromine Director came out. In fact, it was the thing that was called VideoWorks before that. And suddenly, and I'd always been interested in computers. I'd had a thing called a home computer called a ZX Spectrum as a kid and done some noodling around on that. And what happened for me was this, I was always like, I like all of this stuff. What can I do? And for me, multimedia back then was the moment where, I can do all of this stuff myself. Right. And it was very much back then, and for a while, a bit of a sort of one-man show, right? I could make something and bring it to life as interactively, which was a kind of amazing thing to be able to do.
Okay.
And do the sound and shoot stuff and all of those kinds of things. So that's how it kind of segued into that for me and how it sort of came all together.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the work that you're doing, or the artifacts of your work, I think point back to what you're describing in your early transition. I mean, you make a podcast, you are posting some videos, some clips recently that highlight some of the work that you're doing in your leadership coaching. So it feels like you're still inhabiting that making space. I mean, you and I, when we were at Fjord, we worked on the podcast that they made called Fika. Yeah. So this is clearly an area of interest that is carried into your work and your current life as a designer and a coach.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I like that. I mean, sometimes it's a chore, right? And you all know this. Sometimes you've got loads of, shoot all this stuff or record a podcast and it's, oh my God, I've got like 6 of them to edit. But it's actually kind of something that I quite enjoy. Mm-hmm. I resist the whole creator label. But it is nice to make stuff and to put stuff out in the world, especially when I've spent my week kind of mostly talking with people, which I also like, but in the coaching, there's not much actually making anymore. Sure. And I guess I've always liked writing. It's always been a part of my life. And for a little while, for quite a long time, actually, I was a journalist for a design magazine as a sort of little side hustle. I would write a column every month. Okay. And it was a really good discipline to turn out 1,000 words every month. Sure. For quite a few years.
Right. We've tracked back through some of the early parts of your work and then linked it to some ways in which people might see you today on Powers of 10, through your newsletter. But you're mainly focusing on leadership coaching right now, design leadership coaching specifically. Will you talk a little bit more about how you got started in this area? And I asked this question with the context of there seem to be quite a lot of people who are inhabiting the coaching space.
There are now,
for sure.
Irritatingly, when I first started, there were fewer.
Right.
So I'm coming towards the end of I'll be coming into my 5th year. So I started in 2000.
Okay.
And the origin story of it was that, well, first of all, I think it's important to note 2 things. One is I've always done a lot of coaching and mentoring most of my life. It's been a very strong part of my teaching. Yeah. I've had a lot of time with students of all levels, from undergraduates, master students, postgraduates. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I noticed a lot and learned about teaching and learned about people back then was how much people block themselves but think it's the thing. Right? So I really had, when it boiled down to it, I had very few situations either as a lecturer or at Fjord as a design director, when people were really struggling and saying, I don't know how to make this thing. I don't know how to design this. Yeah. What they were always struggling with was one of 2 things, and one of which was themselves. And this sort of anxiety and all those things going on there. Mm-hmm. I had plenty of students in tears in my office. Oh. And quite a few colleagues too. Or people stuff, or both. Right? So people, it was, I kind of really mostly realized this, I think, when I was at Fjord, actually. It was most obvious there, but teams were saying, the team went dysfunctional and they'd fallen out and they were kind of arguing with each other.
Okay.
Well, they had a difficult stakeholder of some kind, either the client or someone from Accenture.
Okay.
And it was really all of that they were asking me to kind of step into and not the, hey, Andy, can you help us design that thing?
Sure.
So in that sense, the design director is actually a real misnomer.
And
so when I left, I thought I was going to do train client teams, which I still occasionally do in all that stuff I mentioned before.
Sure.
And I thought I'd do some kind of mentoring or coaching, but I didn't realize it was going to be such a big part.
Okay.
And when I was on calls with people lining up the work, and these were design leaders, these are people running design departments or whole regions sometimes.
Yeah.
And I was trying to, land the training gigs. I was having these kind of very long other conversations, sort of therapeutic conversations that were along the lines of, I'm really struggling to get stakeholder buy-in and I'm not quite sure how I should build my team out and who should I hire next and this, that, and the other. And I was advising them on that because, I wanted to get the training gig.
Yeah.
And it was my wife, who's a psychotherapist, who said, why are you giving that away for free? And it was that moment I was like, oh, that's the work actually. And I like this. I'm quite good at it. And that's where that came from. And I guess the last thing to say, which is also important, is that, my wife's a psychoanalyst. She's a Jungian from C.G. Jung.
Okay.
And it's what I've done for many years as a self-exploration thing more than anything. And I probably draw as much from that experience of 6 years as I do from my design experience. So that's how the coaching arose. And now I've sort of got this. It's a bit of a niche, but there's what I call the design leadership dip, where there's this moment where people move into a leadership role.
Sure.
Or they've been there for a while and they're either like, I'm in this role and I don't know what I'm doing, or this is where I've always wanted to be.
Yeah.
And now, I'm not really sure that I want to do this. And is this what it's all about? And I don't know. And people go through a sort of mid-career, midlife crisis about at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And my job is to help them through that and to be someone who's also been through that themselves and not just a kind of general life or career coach.
Got it. You linking together not only the parts of your work that you've done as a teacher, and then also from the work that you did at Fjord. And if I remember correctly, your title there was Director of Client Evolution.
It was by the end.
Okay, by the end.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
So that was really about there were client interactions, there were leadership interactions within Fjord, but what I understood is that it was really about the sort of the workshopping practice and the service design elements that Fjord inhabited. So how those things played out for the larger business, almost like train the trainer is the way that I thought of it.
Yeah, it was.
Okay,
yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. So the work that you did as a teacher and that you still do as a teacher, but then the work that you did at Fjord and then the work that you now do as a leadership coach, it sounds like they all draw from the same well.
They do.
Okay.
And that well is reading the room and people. I think one of the things that was a real unlock for me, and again, actually, this is something I realized at Fjord, because when you're in a leadership role, and particularly in a place like, Accenture, where there's a lot of what we might pejoratively say cool suits, there's a lot of people kind of with business backgrounds there.
Sure.
There's this temptation to think when you move into a design leadership role that, now I have to become a suit, right? I have to kind of dress differently, I have to behave differently, and you have to behave a little bit differently.
Sure.
But you don't have to become a completely different person. And in fact, if you jettison your whole experience, your life experience as a designer, then kind of what's the point of you being there, right? Why, instead of just some other MBA?
Right.
And one of the unlocks for me was realizing, because I do like facilitation and I've done a lot of it, which is so akin to teaching, was that it's kind of like slow motion facilitation. That what you're doing a lot of is reading the room and you're seeing, in actual facilitation in a real room, you're looking to see what the energy's like, you're looking to see where someone's checked out and isn't really kind of engaged anymore, or whether people are confused about the purpose of what they're supposed to be doing. Mm-hmm. You look at things that you can do to raise the energy or things to calm down. You do stuff together and it's very vibrant, and you do some stuff where you do stuff when everyone's working on their own in quiet and all of those things. Right down to things like the food on the day or the quality of the Post-it notes, which sound really trivial.
Sure.
But if people are really hungry, or someone has come in and they're like, well, I'm sort of gluten intolerant and I'm vegan, and there's only sort of other stuff there for them, they feel not seen. They get hungry. They get hangry.
Yeah.
Poor Post-it notes fall off when the aircon's on.
Right.
And every designer I know sort of laughs at that, but it's a big deal, right?
Because
then you have this thing, you work all morning, and then you come in after lunch, and it's all on the ground.
Yep.
Right? And so it's all of those things matter, right? Those details matter.
Yeah.
And we do quite a lot about flattening out hierarchy and things like that in those workshops.
Right.
So if you kind of think about that over the course of, days, weeks, months, and years, about, that could be a team on a project, it could be a whole design department or team you're responsible over the course of a year, you can kind of see there's a similar pattern there, and you're really being mindful of like, where are people at?
Yeah.
And I think then the teaching thing, it's mostly about working out how to unlock people's blockages and how to unlock either something that's complex they don't really understand, they're not really getting it, and how to unlock it so it makes sense for them, or how to take away some of the fear and anxiety, because learning is fear creating. Learning is uncomfortable, right? Because you're suddenly doing new things.
It's a change.
And certainly when dealing with clients. Yeah. So dealing with clients, we go in, and in the worst case, we go in as kind of design consultants or service design consultants.
Sure.
And we say, the way you're all working at the moment, you're such idiots, you should be working this way.
Right.
And we don't really kind of realize the effect that has on people and why people might resist that, and what kind of fear and anxiety it kicks up.
Yeah.
And so for me, one of the things that I try now to look at is, when I look at those people who we might describe as suits, is actually trying to understand, why don't they get this? Why isn't this resonating with them? And someone who appears to be being a difficult stakeholder and blocking or aggressive or any of those things, most people aren't like that just for the sake of it. They're usually like that out of fear and anxiety.
Sure.
And when you kind of think, well, what are they afraid and anxious about?
Right.
It's a much more empathetic approach.
Yeah.
And it really provides a pathway to unlocking that and approaching them as well, and thinking, how can I do it? So that's, I guess, where that all comes from. And then if you think of what's going on in coaching, one-to-one, it's like that, but on a one-to-one level.
Right. I want to dig into a couple areas that you just talked about. I know you've written about this before and you've talked about this before in other areas, but this notion of the leadership dip that might happen at the moment you walk into leadership, or it might happen after some period of time. And I know that you've also talked about this notion of imposter phenomenon, or imposter syndrome, as some people call it. Can you say a little bit more about that? And the reason why I think that this is so important and for people to hear is that I don't personally believe that it matters your academic credentials. I don't think that it matters your professional credentials. For any number of reasons, someone might feel unqualified to do a thing that's either in front of them or a series of things in front of them. So would you talk a little bit more about what's underneath there and why that might happen?
Yeah, this needs a bit of unpacking.
Yes,
actually.
please.
So the original research on imposter, what now is now colloquially known as imposter syndrome, was called imposter phenomenon. And the woman who did it interviewed a lot of kind of high-powered female executives, who I think were probably mostly white, mostly North American, I think, if not all. And so there's one thing there, which is to recognize it is a particular sample. I think it's another thing that she called it phenomenon that's more like blushing or kind of being embarrassed than it is a syndrome. Sounds like I've got some kind of condition that I'll never, be afflicted with for the rest of my life. Yeah. Which is to say, I'm a good example, right? I'm white, middle class, middle-aged male, privately educated. Sure. I had so many privileges afforded me. Yep. It's incredibly easy for me. It's not about easy. It's more, it doesn't cost me any kind of social kudos, or not much of it, to call my boss or the CEO. I'm my own boss now, but to call my, someone senior to call them out on something, right? I recognize it's very, very different if you're, say, a woman of color, or someone who's non-binary, and maybe genderqueer, and so there's a whole load of kind of social status, and it's much less safe for someone to be doing that. I understand that it costs them much more to do so. Which is to say, one of the things about imposter syndrome, I think, is that, or phenomenon, is there's the internal thing, which I guess we'll get to in a second. But if people are constantly telling you you're not good enough, or you're not enough, or this isn't for you, or if you're not seeing the representation that people who look like you are in these positions in the world, then it's externally imposed, and and then you internalize it. And so the process in both cases is to kind of take the power out of that and sort of diffuse it. But it's obviously, I want to recognize it's a lot harder if that's your external messaging the whole time.
For sure.
But I think we all have that sense quite often that, I don't know what I'm doing. I've been asked to do something and I really don't know how to do this.
Yeah.
Or I've not done it before. It's usually the thing.
Yeah.
And, one of the things with being in a leadership role is that we pretty much spend our entire lives, right, from childhood through to school and if we've studied and then going to work, we're pretty much spending our whole time with someone else telling us what to do.
Sure.
And there's this weird kind of moment that happens where no one's telling you what to do anymore. You might be given some outcomes to achieve by your boss or whatever.
Sure.
But they're not saying this is how you should do it, because actually you're probably at the top of the tree,
right,
design-wise.
Right. And
so there's this weirdly uncomfortable thing where you're like, well, I'm just making it up. This is just my opinion.
Right.
Who am I to say?
Right.
And you are.
Yeah.
Because that's what leadership means, right? That means if you're leading from the front, it really does mean we're going to go left here. It seems, I think that's a good way to go.
Right.
And through this bit of jungle. The difference is, though, I think where people, one of the ways to start to defuse that is to remember that you've got years of experience behind you. And so it's not just my opinion in that really sort of dilettante way, or that kind of social media way of like, I've just got an opinion, therefore it's right.
Yeah.
You're basing it on years of experience and pattern recognition.
Yeah.
And, if you think about improvising, think about how jazz musicians improvise, yes, they're making it up in the moment, but they practice their scales and they know their chord progressions and all the jazz standards.
Sure.
And so it's not coming from nowhere.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's not like someone's just handed them a saxophone for the first time in their life and then they play. Right? They practice.
Right.
And I think that's important to remember when you're in one of those positions.
Yeah.
To that it's okay.
Yeah. That
it's okay to make it up. It's also okay to be wrong. Right?
Yeah.
Just to recognize it.
Yeah. I want to share a story and then I want to make a point and I have a question. So my story has to do with a friend of mine. We worked together at a previous, and they will remain nameless for the purposes of our conversation. And they work for a very large company. They came to that company through some sort of merger and acquisition. And they have been catapulted into a leadership role. They went from managing a team of 10 to, I think they now manage a team of 250. So quite a lot, a big change all at once. And my friend reached out to their manager and some folks in leadership and said, this is a big sea change for me. This is a very big shift. I need support. I don't know if that's coaching or that's training. I don't know what that looks like, but I need support from the organization. And their tongue-in-cheek response was, well, none of us ever had training. You'll do just fine. And I imagine that conversations like this are happening more often than you think. So that's my anecdote.
Yeah, it does happen quite a lot. And yet, at the same time, it's really common for CEOs, for example, to negotiate as part of their package a coach.
Yeah.
Right? And I think one of the things, it's short-sighted of the organization, really. If someone who's really senior, who's responsible for 250 people is saying, I could do with some support here.
Right.
The investment, I'm going to pitch myself here, but the investment in someone like me, helping them has a multiplier.
Yeah.
Because those 250 people work much better.
That's right.
So, it seems odd to me that you wouldn't invest in that. What I think is a really common thing, I didn't really talk about the dip, and this is part of it, is loneliness at the top.
Yep.
So a large part of my job, I don't really tell people, I'm going to give people my opinion, and I'm not very coachy in that way, actually, classically coachy. Of just sort of asking open questions. Because people come to me because I've been through that role.
Sure.
I phrase it as my opinion. But a large part of my role is just being someone that people can talk to who's at that level.
Sure.
Because a lot of the time when you're in a leadership position as a designer, you're the only one at that level. All your peers are in other parts of the business, and often are kind of got business backgrounds or something else.
Sure.
And it's really lonely because you're also no longer part of the design gang.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You just can't, you can obviously really good relationships with them, but you sort of can't be their friend in the same way because you can always fire them. And even if you think, I'm not going to be like that, they know that.
Right.
And there's always, a friend of mine said it in a really nice way. They said, my job is to buy the first round of drinks and then leave, which is obviously a little bit lonely too.
Yeah.
And so part of why I'm there is to create a safe space for people to go, do you know, this is my idea. What do you think about this? Oh, I don't really know.
Yeah.
And then that's safe. And then part of my job, it's having created that safe space, is to be a little bit annoying.
Yeah.
And ask them annoying questions. They go, well, who cares about this? Why should we care? Why should anyone care about that?
Right.
And it's for them then in the coaching session to go, oh, yeah, actually, I don't really know, rather than when they're on the call with their boss.
Sure.
And to work through that stuff.
Sure.
Because it's lonely, and that's definitely part of that dip.
Yeah, I hear you on that. +1 on that. I also wanted to bring up something that I've seen recently in the design space where there seems to be two things going on. One is there seems to be quite a lot of, whether you call them a player/coach role, and I'm using a sports metaphor, not the coaching, but player coach and coach player. So where someone who's in a managerial position or a director position will still do some of that individual contributor, hands-on keyboard sort of design work. And I wonder how what I think is a trend that's happening plays into the larger conversation about how design leadership is manifesting inside of organizations. Yeah,
it is common, as is the fractional leadership role, actually, which I've heard a lot about that as well. I've heard a few times, a few times as well. It massively depends on the type of organization, right?
Sure.
So there's obviously people in public services, there's people in startups, people in scale-ups, large enterprises, and all that. So it does slightly depend. I think it's quite common if you're designer number one, and then you're growing the team. It's quite common to then sort of end up being in a leadership role because you've hired people underneath you,
right? But
you're still designing.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's also about how the organization perceives you, right? You're still a designer who makes stuff for a living.
Sure.
And, for other people, it's like, no, I really like this, and I really want to keep my hand in and keep my skills going.
Right.
That's one of the reasons why there's that coach player coach. I guess we're talking about the kind of weighting of what they're doing.
That's right.
There's a bit of a burnout danger, though, where as you start taking on more responsibilities about managing and leading people, and still are responsible for some of the actual output of the work, that you just spread yourself too thin.
Yeah. And
you're trying to do it all. And at some point, there's a kind of letting go of things that has to happen.
Yeah.
And again, that's part of the dip. I think you start to, the uncomfortable thing about that is you've probably spent most of your life weaving an identity as a designer, as a creative person of some kind.
As a maker, yeah.
There's someone who makes things for a living, or solves problems, or however you see yourself. And then you start to kind of give some of that up.
Yeah.
Just as you're still learning about the leadership skills and management skills. And that's the dip, right? Where you're kind of a bit rubbish at both. Certainly what happened to me, like, more than once. But I think it's more about an identity thing. About if I don't design anymore, who am I?
Yeah.
What am I about?
Yeah.
Because I think, I don't know, maybe accountants and, HR people feel the same and really identify with their craft. But I think designers bind their self-identity into their work quite strongly. I mean, as much as any other artist do. And so, the unweaving of that is quite an existential moment.
Yeah. Well, there's a little bit of a designed uniform, if you will, like you can almost always tell. And as you pointed out, in a company like Fjord or Accenture, or they're called Accenture Song now, but you can tell there's a visual difference between people who are suits, quote unquote, and folks who are more creative. You've got the funky tennis shoes, you've got a black t-shirt, you've got fun glasses, like lots of different things, maybe even have armful of tattoos or, something like that. But it seems as though there's a bit of a costume for what a designer looks like. And so I do think in that same way that if you build your entire identity, work identity out of I do this thing and this is how I do it, what I look like, then all of a sudden, if you have to change your uniform or shift it a tiny bit, what does that mean for you as a person?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a deeper thing there. I mean, it's absolutely true. And I've caught myself, I was going to a meeting at Accenture. They have things called client account leads. In other companies, they would be like the senior partners or whatever, the people who are basically in charge of a large account with a client.
Sure.
And I caught myself going to an important meeting with one of those people and thinking, I'll put on some, slightly smarter clothes. I mean, more formal clothes.
Sure.
I mean, it's not like I was scruffy. And then I kind of thought, no, I'm going to wear my trainers.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, that guy said to me in the lift on the way up to the client, he looked down at my trainers and went, well, couldn't you have put on a smart pair of brogues? And I said to him, if I do that, and I go in, they're going to think I'm a consultant. They're going to think I'm like you.
Sure.
And what you're doing here in our pitch is, hey, we're actually bringing real design, not kind of pseudo, management consultant design, into this environment.
Right.
And it's actually important. So, it's that sort of meta communication thing of the medium is the message. How you then turn up is important.
Yeah.
I think some designers, really lean into that heavily in a corporate environment because they absolutely want to kind of make that identity known and sort of preserve that identity. It's a sort of armor as much as it is a costume.
Yeah.
Right? But I would argue so is a suit and tie.
For sure. For sure.
So
they both are.
I have seen people treat people really badly, actually, as other human beings in ways they wouldn't do in a business context or act in a certain way. And it's like, why would you be like that?
Yeah.
You would never treat even an acquaintance that you didn't like very much, you'd never treat like that.
Yeah.
But somehow the suit and tie is this armor that kind of allows you to be, somehow less empathetic. And I'm of the firm belief that the idea of it's not personal, it's just business is a massive lie. I think it's always personal.
It's always personal. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I like that extension that you made about calling it armor, because whether it's a black t-shirt and, like you said, cool trainers, or it's a suit and tie, even if it's the version with the blazer and the dress shirt and the jeans, right? That's still an armor, right? It's a costume. It's a get up. So, and I like what you said. I mean, a lot of times when folks talk about design, there's this notion of user-centered, human-centric, thinking about the person at the heart of this design. And I think in the same way that design problems, whether they are structural, organizational, or on a screen, that they all ladder back to the person. So whether it's they have a certain goal in mind or they have something they want to accomplish, they're having a problem, you're a problem solver, you make things, whatever the myriad of identities and goals are, it sounds like this all flows back into what is the people problem here? What is the person problem?
Yeah. And I think some of the stuff I was talking about is when people feel terribly uncomfortable having people and emotional conversations at work. And I think we're not taught how to. I mean, people have hard enough problems having those conversations with their partners right? And in their family or their close friends. But it's very, very common for people to have a real kind of problem relationship at work.
Yeah.
And the way they deal with it is a very sort of process-based thing, or they hide behind a process. I mean, firing someone is the classic one. It's the whole kind of HR process that isn't human at all.
Sure.
In fact, makes it worse.
Yeah.
And then, there's a whole load of kind of legal arse covering that goes on there as well.
Right.
But actually, to have the genuine human conversation, it kind of takes quite a lot more than saying, well, this is just a process. It's business, not personal. And then you can kind of somehow shut it away.
Yeah.
And, there's a thing that comes up in coaching quite often where someone's got really difficult relationship with someone, or it's turned kind of pretty toxic, or even just kind of uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And there's some conflict there, and they just both avoid it. And then in the coaching sessions, like, Andy again, I had this conversation with him, and he did that thing again, and what I ask these days is, well, what is it you really want to say to that person? And then they give me the version with lots of swear words in it. And then we work out. And then my answer is really, well, why don't you just say that?
Right.
But without the swear.
Right.
and find a time when you're not in a heightened emotional state
Right.
to talk about it to that person, or arrange something, arrange a meeting or a call with that person where it is, that's the agenda.
Yeah.
There's no other stuff. You're not trying to cram it in at the end of another meeting about something else, where you're literally having a meeting to say, I'd like to talk about our relationship.
Yeah.
It's kind of like couple therapy, right?
Right.
And be more intentional about it. And, it's not always going to work, but a lot of the time, they say what they really wanted to say in a measured way. And the next session, really changed everything, and they really understood, and they kind of really got where I was coming from, and I understood them a bit better and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
But because it's business, not personal, we push that stuff away, and then we live in these unpleasant relationships all the time at work.
Yeah. One of the things that I wanted to chat about was something you said earlier about reading the room. And right now, you and I are we're recording this podcast on a video call. How do a lot of your interactions these days happen? Are your coaching calls on video? And if whatever proportion that is, how does that go into reading the room? Because there is something when you're standing in a room with other people, you can feel tension. You can see that there's a little bit of a mishmash happening at table 3 over there. Oh, and maybe I shouldn't have put so-and-so with so-and-so. They have a disagreement, so you can reorganize. I wonder how reading the room happens in a digital way these days for you.
Yeah, so almost all of my coaching is via Zoom, or video chat.
Yep.
And I have a teleprompter. I bought one of those Elgato teleprompters.
Oh, interesting.
Here. So I'm looking at you. The camera's behind the 45-degree mirror that I'm looking at.
Got it.
And since I've had it, it's really, really helped, because I'd got into the habit of talking into the camera, which was just above my screen, in order to make sure I'm looking people in the eyes. But then whilst I'm looking into into the camera, I'm not looking at them.
Sure.
Or if I'm looking at them, they see my eyes kind of looking down a little bit.
Yep.
And, that's really helped. It was a tiny thing, but it really makes a massive difference, to at least my kind of ability to read, and hopefully the sense of empathy from the other side. Mm-hmm. But it's also quite unnatural, right? We don't usually talk to people staring at them for ages and ages, for an hour.
Right.
And in fact, some of what we're doing when we use some artifacts or get people to make things or something. Right. And this is really a tip I give to people trying to give feedback and critique about stuff, is to try and turn it into this thing where it is a side-by-side looking at a third thing experience, rather than face-to-face, right? Particularly when you're sort of critiquing work. And so that can help. I'm listening a lot, probably more than looking at, where people are. Well, I actually look for where the sort of flickers of emotion are. When someone touches on something, I can see, their eyes have gone a bit glassy, or that's going to choke them up a bit, or, and people often do a thing, they'll talk about something and you can see it makes them a little bit uncomfortable, and then they'll distract and they'll say, so anyway, and if it's appropriate, I don't do it all the time, so bring people back to that and go, what was going on there when you were talking about that? Sure. Because, I sort of, it's important to then get to what's emotionally behind it. Yeah. I'm not a therapist though, so I have to kind of I try and keep a space where, if you had sort of training down one end where I'm saying, you should do this, you should do that, and therapy for designers down the other end, I'm coaching somewhere in the middle, and it moves around on that spectrum. I see. And then I think in terms of, you could read a bit of body language, but I know what you mean. You can't tell the kind of impatience so easily. Yeah. You certainly can't tell it on, well, maybe you can. Slack is a funny medium. There's a real generational difference between the way people interact as well on those kind of other media. And then I think when you're doing a workshop, you're doing something, everyone's on a Miro board or something. Yep. There's actually Daniel Stillman, I think, who wrote a great book called Good Talk, which actually got me to the idea of the slow motion facilitation thing, actually. Okay. He said, well, you can kind of read the board, right? You look at people's cursors and you can see where there's no activity at all, or there's lots of people kind of buzzing around and doing stuff. You actually kind of get a sense of how the room and each group is doing from that. It's probably about reading some of the subtler signals, I think, in those media. Got it.
I wonder, and for people who aren't paying attention to some of the things that you're putting out into the world, you do a weekly kind of video? Yeah. Okay, mostly semi-weekly talk about some of the things that you're hearing from your coaching clients, but I wonder if there's something that pops for you right now that feels like this is something I keep hearing over and over.
Yeah, so I do these coaching reflections, I've called them. They are, quite often a thing that comes up. I mean, it's obviously because my brain is biased in a certain direction. Mm-hmm. I'm making a pattern, but I don't think it's necessarily in the zeitgeist. But what happens quite often, I have a week and I have the same conversation 3 times in coaching, and I'm like, oh, it's interesting. What's going on there?
Sure.
And so I'll put those up, and part of it is just to put some stuff out there in the world, and obviously a little bit of it is like, look at me, come and hire me.
Sure.
But a lot of it's also, I keep thinking, well, this would be useful for other people, and I think that would be a good thing. And if there's one thing I want people to get out of any of that content is, it's not just me. Other people have this. Right? That's the main reason for putting that stuff out there.
Yeah.
I would say most recently I have had that thing I just talked about, actually, which is, no, the very first one all the time is time and boundaries. Mm-hmm. Right? So that people really struggling to set time and boundaries and say no. But it feeds into the sort of conflict, aversion, and sort of people pleaser thing that often comes up.
Yeah.
I think designers are particularly bad at that, actually. They sort of want to be people pleasing. But setting time and boundaries, saying to someone who says to you on a Friday, this needs to be done by Monday.
Sure.
It's not going to get done, Yeah. And because if you don't set that boundary, they never get the feedback loop that their ambitions are greater than their ability to plan or their desire to resource the thing. Yeah. So if it turns up on Monday and you've done it, well, that worked, right? Yeah. So why wouldn't they do it again?
Yeah.
I think I've learned a lot more about this from training my dog, actually, than anything else. You're reinforcing behaviors you don't want.
Sure.
Right?
It's funny that you say that. I don't know if this will make it into the show, but I'm reading Malcolm Gladwell's collection of New Yorker essays right now called What the Dog Saw. And the title story is about Cesar Millan. And it's funny that you said that because I have been thinking in reading that essay, how does this apply to my work as a designer? And I haven't quite jumped the chasm yet, but I think there's something there. There are 3 components that he talks about: love, something, and discipline that is important for training a dog, like having a healthy relationship with a dog. And I think only one of the 3, usually pet keepers don't give the animal discipline. They only give them the love and affection, or love and exercise. I think that's what it is. Love, exercise, and discipline. But yeah, we forget that discipline part. And I think, not that humans are dogs, I don't think that's what we're saying, but I do think there is a boundary setting that is important when dealing with other people. This is what I can do. This is the time frame, as you said, time and boundaries. Here's the time frame that I think that I can do the thing that you're asking for, and this is the shape of what it looks like.
Yeah, humans aren't dogs, but we are also behavioral animals, right? And
we're pack animals too, like dogs. Yeah.
Animals. Yeah. And so the thing about, cognitive behavioral therapy, it's all about that. I mean, it's all about kind of reinforcing positive cycles and not negative cycles. Yeah. I think we confuse the word discipline with punishment quite often.
That's a good distinction.
Kind of think of those things as the same thing. And punishment is obviously, something negative, and punishment. In fact, there's a whole thing in the kind of behavioral, there's like a 4x4 matrix of that. And punishment is negative reinforcement. I think that's the one. Which you don't do with animals. You try very, very, only in a kind of emergency situation would you ever kind of do something like that.
Yeah.
But in general, what you're trying to do is, in dog training, you reward good behavior.
That's right.
And you don't reward any other behavior. It's not like you don't punish. It's not like you punish it.
Right.
They don't get a treat if they don't do the thing.
That's right.
And so they very quickly learn, if I want the treat, then I do that thing, and then eventually you don't need the treat anymore.
The reinforcement.
And I kid you not, that's what I mean by when someone comes to you and says, could you do this thing in this ridiculously short amount of time?
Right.
And you say yes, then you're reinforcing that negative behavior, and they think it's okay.
Yeah.
And you also, there's a whole lot of kind of status stuff that kind of plays into that.
Yeah.
There's a thing that happens when someone comes to you. Usually they've got a thing on their plate they want to get off of their plate, or they can't do, or they need someone else to do. And at that point, it's still their problem.
Sure.
If you say to them, sorry, I don't have time to do this, it's not going to get done. I wish next time it'd be great if you came to me earlier, or I can do it by this later time, or so-and-so can do it.
Yep.
At that point, when you turn them down and say no, you let them down, and it's still their problem.
Sure.
And they still have time to do something about it.
Right.
And then what happens is otherwise, as soon as you say, yeah, okay, no, I can't really, I don't have time. Yeah, okay, well, I'll take it on. Now it's your problem.
Yeah.
They've got it off of their plate and onto yours.
Sure.
And you're faced with this thing. If you either don't deliver and say, I'm really sorry, I didn't get it done.
Right.
And now they don't have any time to do anything about it.
Right.
So now you look flaky.
Right.
It's you,
right.
not the other person who would have looked flaky if they hadn't managed to get someone to do it.
Right.
Because they hadn't planned properly.
Right.
So now it's your fault.
Yep.
And it's your problem.
Yep.
And on top of, and so the response quite often is, well, I'll have to work on, Sunday night to do it.
Right. Right.
I think over and over again, a lot of leaders, senior leaders in business, like I said, they have ambitions beyond their ability or willingness to resource them. And until you say no, until they can't get what they want, well, they're just going to carry on doing it, because why wouldn't they?
Yeah.
Just like a dog.
That skills confidence mismatch. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, Andy, how do you envision your work as a leadership coach evolving in the future? Do you have hopes? Do you have some concerns about maybe some of the things that are happening in the working world?
I have concerns about what's going on in the working world. I feel that obviously, it was quite hard for me, quite certainly at the beginning of the year when all the layoffs were happening and there was a lot of chaos going on and a lot of kind of self-flagellation as well amongst designers. Like, oh, we haven't proven our value and all of that stuff.
Oh, the seat at the table.
Whereas I actually think the design project has been quite a lot of a success, really. I see designers everywhere now in all sorts of organizations, and they just weren't there 15 years ago.
Sure.
That was a bit of a tough time. Now I feel like budgets are coming back. I have a mix of people paying me privately and their work paying me, and actually quite a few more people's work has been paying for me recently, which is, I think, an encouraging sign. I really feel like we're coming out the bottom of a dip.
Yeah.
And we'll emerge different, by we, I mean design as a discipline.
Sure.
But I feel like we're coming out of that. Some of the things I would like to do is, I started writing, I've got some of and the outline of a book about all of this because, like I said, really I wanted to put something out there for people to read. And it's kind of the thing you were never told in design school. And the thing, if you're lucky, you learn from having other design leaders who are really good role models. If you're unlucky, and, all the people who work for you now are unlucky, and you had a couple of toxic people whose behavior you then, repeat, then you don't have any other things to kind of look at. Yeah. And so it's less around, this is how you do design, this is how you set up teams, and it's less tactical because people like Peter Merholz are really good for those kinds of things. It's more about, hey, you're going to go on this inner journey and it's going to feel like this and feel sometimes really uncomfortable and scary and all of those things. And I know everyone says it's a privilege, but I really feel it's a great privilege of speaking to, now it's about 120 people about their, inner churn and everything that's going on as they're in those roles. And I would like to share that experience so other people can look at that and, get some tips and tricks and all those kinds of things, but also feel like, oh yeah, this is actually normal and expected, not, I'm the odd one out here and everyone else knows what they're doing. Yeah. So I wonder, Andy, is there anything, and we've talked about quite a number of topics, but is there any topic that we haven't talked about that you want to get into that you think we should spend some time on? I really don't want to talk about this. AI is kind of looming its head, and there's a lot of kind of stuff around, it's going to take our jobs and all of that. I do think product design in particular has got itself kind of pushed onto the assembly line in a bad way. And if you think there's a sort of the bottom third of product management, which I think is kind of really poor. Yeah. There's other people who do it really well and have really good relationships with designers and engineers, but there's a kind of a subset where that came in, I think, unskilled, and when it was the hottest, ticket of the day. Treat design as a way to get their ideas, mock-ups of their ideas to engineering. Right? And if that's how you think about that, and you think this person is really just my hands and I don't know Figma, sure, and I just need them to do that, then of course, basically what you've already been doing is sort of prompt engineering to your designer GPT. Yeah. Right? And therefore I can kind of see why that would happen. I think none of that stuff is going to end terribly well for, a bunch of reasons. I think it's just, I don't think the business model is really there for the cost of it, and certainly the energy cost of it. Yeah. So I personally am a skeptic and think it will kind of collapse. It will, it'll still be around in some way, but I think the bubble will burst. I still think that one of the things designers are very good at is discernment and taste.
Yeah.
Someone else said this, so it doesn't come from me, but I think that's one of those things that AI is really poor at.
Yeah.
And so I'm hopeful that we'll still be around in some form.
Yeah. So we can beat the six-fingered man, as it were.
Well, also this kind of, there's already been pre-AI, this push towards a mediocre middle.
Yeah.
Every app looks the same.
Yeah.
Every website looks the same.
Yep.
And one of the reasons is I think that everyone's trying to go as fast as they possibly can. Like velocity is a huge thing.
Sure.
And I think it's really overrated.
Yeah.
And it's just become I ask people, they say, well, we have to get this stuff done by X. Our bosses want us to go faster. And I ask them why.
Sure.
And they don't know.
Sure.
And if they ask their boss, in the end, if you keep asking, laddering it up, it's usually because someone very wealthy wants to become more wealthy quicker.
Sure.
And that's not a good reason to work weekends and evenings.
Yeah.
But I also think what happens is when people are under pressure, they'll lean into the things that they know how to do well already, that there are existing patterns of out there, or that the tools do very well.
Yeah.
And so that's why you end up with everything starting to look the same.
Yeah. Yes, and to that, I think there's also, and I've seen this before in a variety of client engagements as well as companies that I've worked for, I feel like design folks are less good at attaching the work that they do to business targets and outcomes. You're absolutely right. This notion of we need this faster. Why? And the idea of making money or whatever the revenue is. But I think even deeper than that, that design becomes even more valuable. The capital D design and the little d design becomes far more valuable when you can say, these are the things that we're doing for the business based on the work at hand.
Yeah. And I think the reason for that is we spend the first half of our career, or a large portion of our career, talking design to designers.
Yeah.
And so there's a whole bunch of self-evident truths that make sense to us.
Yeah.
And it's not that they don't make sense. Stakeholders in other areas just don't care, and it's not their job to care.
Sure.
Like the CEO, the big shocking truth, I think, for a lot of design leaders is to realize the CEO doesn't really care about design, even if they've installed you as the head of design.
Yeah.
They care about something else. Yeah. And so there's a magic question that I always ask, which is, so what? Who cares?
Mm-hmm.
Why does this matter?
Sure.
And it's the way to ladder that up. So if you say, well, we want more service designers on this, in our team, well, so what? Who cares? Your CEO doesn't care.
Right.
Any more than, if the accountants say we need more accountants, they don't kind of go, well, why? So you say, well, because then we can get a better sense of, we're siloed at the moment and we really need some people to kind of map out the interconnected stuff or map out the end-to-end experience and see where we're failing and where there's sort of handoffs between things.
Sure. So
what? Who cares? Why does that matter?
Right.
And it will get up to something like, well, we will make fewer mistakes. We will send fewer people to the call center,
sure.
Or support. We will not have to do things twice,
right,
and all of that stuff. Eventually, it always ladders up to we can make more money, we can save money, or we can mitigate risk.
Right.
And sort of preventing risk is really saving money in disguise.
Sure.
And so, but in that ladder, depending on what stakeholder you're talking to, you find the right thing that they care about. And then you can kind of start there and go, well, we keep repeating a lot of work and it costs us a lot of money and resources that we could be putting elsewhere on innovative things and all of that.
Sure.
And that is quite compelling.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, we don't want to be doing that. We really want to be. Well, the way we think we can do that is if we map out the end-to-end process.
Yeah.
And then you're saying, and so in order to do that, we need some more service designers.
Right.
And you start at the other end. And that I've found is a really, when I get people to present their stuff to me in coaching, that's almost always what we do, which is to try and get it out of that self-evident loop of, more service designers. Why? Because service designers are great.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, two things.
Or whatever flavor.
Yes, fill in the blank designer.
Yeah.
Two things occur to me as you're talking. The question that you ask, the big question, is another version of, and maybe it's not 5 of them, but it's almost like the 5 whys. Like you really boil it down to get to that core reason. Yep. And then I'm reminded of an article that Jared Spool wrote back in 2019 around how designers need to think and talk like an executive. Part of that's for buy-in and part of that's for lots of other reasons. But I think taking it out of that echo chamber of this is what we do as designers. Like we work on aesthetics and color combinations, and which, if you boil it down to matters like accessibility and people being able to access a system, that becomes much more tangible than I like this blue better, right? Yeah. Which I think how people perceive designers' work now.
Yeah, I kind of agree and disagree. I know what you're saying.
Yep.
And I seem to remember reading that article, and there's a few other people who've kind of written similar things. I think it's not so much that you have to talk like an executive. In fact, I think you said this, is to kind of think like them and understand, what matters to that person. Yeah. And so that's really empathetic, right? What does this person care about? That's why I talk about the fear and anxiety thing, because usually what are they afraid and anxious about is a really good starting point for what they care about.
Sure.
Because we care about the stuff. And there's a very good book by Dave Gray, who a lot of people will know from his other work, like the Connected Company and game storming and stuff.
Okay, it's
an early book of his. It's called Selling to the VP of No. And it's all about that. It's all about that kind of process of trying to. This person has got 100 people coming to them every day saying, "I want resources," and they've got a limited amount of resources.
Sure.
So how do you persuade them that they should spend it on yours instead of someone else?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of stuff in there around that kind of thinking that we're talking about.
Okay.
But the bit that I disagree with is what I was saying before, which is not to lose your identity and your superpowers as a designer. Most people cannot make an idea tangible in anything other than a deck or writing. So most meetings are there where people are saying, well, I've got this idea and we're talking about this thing, and here's a sort of really awful diagram with arrows going everywhere, classic management consultant diagram.
Right.
Arrows pointing at everything else,
right?
And or some bullet points. And what they're trying to do is an act of telepathy. They're trying to say, I've got this idea in my head and I'm trying to get it into yours.
Yep.
What designers are really, really good at, and we forget because we kind of do it all day, is I've got an idea about something. Let me show you. And that's either really a good diagram that explains something that's quite abstract, and that we all know things like journey maps and other things. They're all abstractions from the whole thing,
for sure.
Or the classic Venn diagram.
Yep.
But we're also able to make sketches of things and or make a mock-up of something, or make for services which are often intangible, right?
Yeah.
You can make a video of this is what it would be like with real people and fake touch points that you do a kind of day in the life of video.
Sure.
And it's a great communication tool, because then you have that thing of someone going, well, I don't really understand this. Instead of like, I don't really understand this, I don't really get this, I'm going to just say no.
Yeah.
They see a thing and they're like, oh, well, that should exist in the world. Yeah, take the resources, take my money.
Yeah.
And we're really good at doing that.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important thing to remember as a designer in a leadership role.
Yeah. That is absolutely a fair point. And yes, thank you. So let's jump into our closing questions. We have some quick closing questions that we do with all of our guests. Andy, what's something that a significant lesson or something that you now know in your life that you wish you would have known earlier?
I think I've learned so many things. I've learned an awful lot from my students and coachees, actually. This is the weird thing about that, is that when you teach or you coach, people look at you as if you know all the answers. But actually, I feel like I'm getting lessons the whole time. I would say one that just comes to mind, because I talked about it at the Service Design Global Conference last week, is that I have been the difficult stakeholder. So there's this sketch that people know by Mitchell and Webb, and they're dressed up in kind of like Nazi-esque kind of uniforms in a film, and they're having a chat with each other, and they turn to each other and they're like, "Are we the baddie?" And because you see them as the normal people,
right?
And then they're like, "Oh, hang on," they've just realised they're the baddies in the movie,
right?
Or in this war. And I think I've realised that I have been the difficult stakeholder. It was a bit of a unpleasant realisation, but I've definitely been someone who has been the kind of arrogant, belligerent, cocky, whatever, blocking stakeholder as a design leader, particularly to some other colleagues in business who didn't really get what I was being like that about, and burnt some bridges.
I see.
And so I think I learned far too late that that's a thing that can happen, and also what pushes my buttons to kind of make me get me in that stage.
That is interesting, that turnaround of seeing yourself from another vantage point. So, Andy, what are you watching right now, or reading or listening to, something that's got you really excited?
I've been reading a lot about relationships, actually, and for the kind of both for myself, but also for the work I do. And Esther Perel, who most people know from her work, talking about relationships and sex in particular. And, I think kind of sex is interesting because it's the thing that everyone supposedly does, but no one really talks about, even with their partners.
Right.
And there's, I think, a parallel to that thing that I was talking about earlier in work, which is if sex is kind of the parallel to human emotions in the workplace, that nobody wants to talk about it. Yeah. No one wants to go there, and yet everyone suffers from it. So this is the kind of thing that's going off in my head. Anyway, recently on her podcast feed, she's had a couple of sessions that she's recorded with people who are business partners.
I see.
And one of them I listened to was called You're Inching Me Out. It's from these two British guys, or one's kind of half German, half British. And they started this business together. It's like kind of advertising, Marcom's sort of branding company, I think.
Okay.
And they've sort of gone different ways, right? They've gone different. And one of them keeps leaning into, well, yeah, that's a business decision and stuff. And the other one's going, but we used to be really good friends, and I really had your back earlier on, and now you don't have mine.
Right.
And then Esther Perel applies her Esther Perelness to it. And it's really touching. It's very moving.
Yeah.
And I've had that come up in coaching fairly often, actually, where that's been going on. And so it was really fascinating for me to see it cast in that light. So that's been very, very good. That's been something I've been listening to recently.
Got it. And we'll link to it in the show notes so that way people have a way to access it easily. So Andy, if you were given unexpectedly a day off and you had unlimited resources on this day, what's something that you would do?
Unlimited resources.
Yeah.
And I only have a day to do it in.
And only a day.
Got
to apply a constraint.
See, there's a
somehow.
constraint there.
Exactly.
So unlimited resources to actually constrain it quite a lot in a day.
Exactly.
I think I would do... I would probably travel. I would either go and travel and see people I haven't seen for a while, for a very long time. Because I just had that experience last week, and that was nice.
Yeah.
Or I think I would go and do something that I haven't ever done before. I talked about this quite often, about sort of tandem skydiving, and I've done it twice in my life. But maybe I'd do something like that, where I go and have an experience that I have never had before.
Okay.
And probably something that kind of shakes me out of my sloth and stasis, I would think.
Yeah. What's one thing that you think will be true in 1 year?
People are still going to be struggling to relate with each other, but desperately want to.
So for people who want to learn more about you or your work, apart from our discussion, and like I said, we'll have links in the show notes, where can they find out additional information about you?
So the place where it all is at polaine.com, my website, POLAINE.com. If you go to that and then /coaching, you'll get to my coaching practice. The podcast is called Powers of 10 that I have, and where I interview people in all spectrums of design and sort of design adjacent things. Yeah. And then you'll find that in all the places where you find podcasts, wherever you listen to this one. And then I have a YouTube channel that's my name. In search Andy Polaine on YouTube, you'll find it. I'm A Polaine. Okay. On YouTube, where the coaching reflections are. The podcast goes up there. Some other bits and pieces sometimes too. Yeah. And then the last thing is I have a newsletter called Doctor's Note. And if you just go to newsletter.polaine.com, you will find it there.
Got it.
I'm on Mastodon and LinkedIn as well. I'm not on Twitter anymore. Yeah. For obvious reasons.
Well, thank you, Andy. I really appreciate your time and our conversation today. Over the years, I think of you quite fondly, and I feel like every time we interact, I always learn something from you, and this time has been no different. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for the stimulating questions too.
Yeah. That's a wrap for this episode of the How This Works show. Thanks for tuning in and for supporting us. If you enjoyed it, please share the show with just one other person. That would mean a lot. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also find us online at howthisworks.show. That's 4 words, no dashes. Again, that's howthisworks.show. We're now publishing our full episodes on YouTube and also active in most social media places. I hope you found my conversation with Andy insightful. I know I did. Until next time, stay curious, and we'll chat again soon.
Just thought my wife just got someone who's a patient has arrived, and I don't know if you can hear them in the background, but I can. Can you hear them?
I don't. No, I can't. Nope.
Okay. I think there might be a couple of door slams. That's what I was waiting for. I will just go for it. If there's a door slam, then I will. Hang on.
Yeah, I heard that.
Yeah, you can hear that.
Yeah.
Even though I've got a super directional mic, actually. But... Okay.
There, you called it.
Yeah. She just dropped her keys or something.
Oh, okay. I didn't know if that was a door.
Hang on a sec.
Yep.
I don't know if you want to. I don't know if you've got pause on here, or we'll just leave it running.
We can just leave it running. I'll have my editor knock it out.